Last week, I got to attend a breakfast for Christian business leaders, and we heard from a speaker. We heard from the men's basketball coach at NDSU, David Richmond, and he talked about his faith and how his faith impacts how he coaches. And he knows he only has a short amount of time with his student athletes, like from age 18 to 22 or 23. And so he wants to make the most of that time and have a positive impact on their lives. And so he shared with us his mission statement and his purpose statement. And then he also shares the promise he makes, the commitment to each athlete. He said he promises to provide a safe, secure, and loving environment to all while establishing uncomfortable circumstances and adversity. So he wants them to be safe and secure, but he also lets them know he's going to make them uncomfortable and put them in places of adversity. And you may wonder, why is he doing that? Well, he goes on to say, so that students can mature as people, athletes, and eventually as professionals in any field. So he shared that from his own lived experience in the things he's gone through in life and in his faith, that he's always grown the most when he's been challenged, when he's had to figure something out that he didn't previously know. And he says he doesn't feel like he's just coaching basketball. He's mentoring young people at a really important time span in their lives. And this tracks with what Jonathan Haidt says about mentoring in the book, The Anxious Generation. For young people to develop in any culture, they need to have certain ingredients. And this is what he says. He says that to develop and mature, you need role models to look up to. So he said parents are so important, but you also need to make sure that there's other adults that your kids can look up to and learn from and be loved by. Then kids also need challenges. They need that discomfort and adversity to help grow. And then they need public recognition for when they reach milestones, and then continued mentoring through adulthood. And if I were to add one more, I would add a fifth thing. I would say find someone else to mentor, someone who's not as far down the path as you are. Mentoring is what Jesus did for the disciples. So Jesus was around 30 years old when he started his formal ministry, when he started to gather young disciples. And these disciples were in their late teens or early 20s. I think sometimes we have an idea that they were all older back then. If you've seen any old-timey Sunday school movies, you see these men following Jesus who had long gray beards. They were 18 to 22. They did not have long gray beards when they were following Jesus. Jesus himself was 30 years old when he started this mentoring program. Jesus was a rabbi, which means a Jewish teacher, and the word disciple means students. And so Jesus gathered these students and he built a safe, secure environment where then these young disciples could then trust him so that he could take them to uncomfortable places and have them face adversity. Jesus formally mentored these disciples for 3 years, and that's not very long. He had to pour everything that he could into them for 3 years and make the most of his time with them so that they would be equipped to then eventually be leaders themselves. Our Bible passage starts out saying, 8 days after these sayings of Jesus, so the thing that happened up on the mountaintop, there was something significant that happened 8 days before. What did Jesus say to his disciples 8 days before that moment in his life? Well, he told them what was going to be happening to him soon. Jesus gathered his disciples and he said, very soon, I'm going to have to suffer. I'm going to be rejected by our religious leaders, and then I'm going to be killed. And after 3 days, I'm going to be raised from the dead. Now, this is a lot for Jesus' students to take in, because they thought Jesus was going to have great glory and honor and achieve a lot of earthly success. Like, a lot of people were interested in him. He was healing people. He was doing miracles. Anytime he had a teaching, people would travel from miles around to see him. And his disciples thought, well, yeah, I mean, he's provocative, but everybody's not just going to turn on him. How could that happen? How could Jesus have to undergo suffering and die? And they got so fixated on that, they didn't hear when he said, and 3 days later, I'm going to be raised from the dead. But that'd be a lot for any of us to take in. But then he throws a challenge at them. He says, I myself am going to have to suffer and die for the cause of love. And so he asks them, would you be willing to do the same to keep following me? If you keep following me, he says, you will not be spared from adversity and suffering. He tells them this, if any of you want to become my followers, you're going to have to deny yourselves, take up your cross, and follow me. That is a lot for these students to hear from their mentor. So 8 days after telling them this, he takes them up on a mountain where he takes time to pray. And this was something that was normal for Jesus to do. This is already the 5th time in Luke's gospel where it says Jesus went away to a private place to pray. And so they saw Jesus model this for them, where he would shut out all the chaos of life to focus on his connection with God. But this time when Jesus was praying, something unusual happened. It says that his face or his appearance changed in some way. His clothes became dazzling white. And then Moses and Elijah showed up. Now, Moses and Elijah had been dead for hundreds of years by the time Jesus was around. So this is a pretty big deal. So it's these ghostly figures of these 2 role models from the Old Testament of Scripture. And at our men's Bible study last week, we have a weekly study every Thursday morning. One of the men asked, how did they know it was Moses and Elijah? And another one of the wise men there said, well, they must have had name tags. And I don't know any other reason or any other way they knew. So maybe that checks out. But Moses and Elijah were role models for both Jesus and his disciples. In the Old Testament, Moses was the man who led the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt. He was the one who went up a mountaintop and received the 10 commandments written on stone tablets. He represented the law in what we call the Old Testament. And Elijah was a prophet and a warrior, and he was someone who had done battle with false prophets, and he had to run away and try to escape from being murdered, and he went up on a mountain, and he received a message from God. So when you have Moses and Elijah together, they're representing really important things in the Hebrew Scripture, the law and the prophets from our Old Testament. And so one of the disciples, Peter, he was always the first to speak up, and he was so inspired by what he was witnessing on this mountaintop that he says, Jesus, hey, this is cool. Let's build some stuff to commemorate this moment. We can build a structure for you and Moses and Elijah. And he was so excited about it, and it wasn't a bad idea. It just missed the point. This visit from Moses and Elijah was not an invitation to look backwards. It wasn't an invitation to stay frozen in the present moment. It was a moment of preparation to look forward to what God was going to do next. And so these former mentors from the Old Testament show up to prepare them for God's next part of God's mission, which is Jesus' death and resurrection. God's way of saving the world through selfless love. And as Peter is talking, God himself interrupts Peter. How amazing would that be? So Peter's saying, let's build this stuff. And it says a cloud came and interrupted him as he was talking. Have any of you ever been up on a mountain on a hiking trip where you're covered in a cloud. Or maybe you're even so high up on a mountain that the clouds are below you. I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but it's an amazing experience. And so Peter experiences this, and instead of just being covered by the cloud, he hears God's voice. That's got to be amazing. And what he hears God say is, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." And this isn't the first time we hear God's voice coming out of a cloud in Luke's gospel. We hear this at the beginning of Luke's gospel when Jesus is first starting out his ministry. And he goes and gets baptized by John the Baptist. And as Jesus is coming up out of the water, the heavens part, and from the clouds, God says, "This is my son, my beloved. With you I am well pleased." So the first time we hear God's voice in Luke's gospel, it's to help prepare Jesus for Jesus' mission. And now this time when we hear it, I think it's for the benefit of the disciples, because they're being prepared for what comes next for them. The baton is soon going to be passed from Jesus to his disciples, from the mentor to the students. And the disciples are being prepared to step up and lead. And this event on the mountain is called the Transfiguration moment, where they have this crazy mystical experience with these two dead mentors of Jesus and of the disciples. And this is a moment where God is publicly recognizing that a big transition is taking place. This is the last week of our sermon series that we've been calling Calm in the Chaos. And the things that we've talked about this month are all in the book, The Anxious Generation. And this book, The Anxious Generation, isn't a Christian book. It's just a research book that talks about how our young people and our youngest generations are experiencing more anxiety and higher rates of anxiety than older generations, and what we can do to help. And it's amazing that all the things that are talked about that help our younger generations are things we are called to do here as Jesus followers. So these are the things that are listed in the book. Finding moments of shared sacredness. That's what we do in worship. When we come to church, we gather together with a bunch of other people, and we're all trying to connect to God. We're sharing this moment of sacred connection with God. Another thing we do is have moments of stillness and silence. That's something that we believe is involved in the act of prayer. When we have conversations with God, we speak and we listen, and there's times of silence. Also, being slow to anger and quick to forgive is advised. They stole that right from Jesus in this book, because our natural tendency is to be quick to anger and slow to forgive. But we come here to be shaped by Jesus' forgiveness. And then experiencing awe is something that helps us cope with anxiety. And then mentoring to help each other grow is another way that we can cope and deal with the changes of life and deal with anxiety. So I've got some questions for you. Who do you look up to as a mentor, as somebody who's a trustworthy follower of Jesus that you would want to emulate and learn from them? So who do you look up to? And then who can you mentor? Who can you look to, somebody who's not as far down the road as you, but you could invest in them and care for them and encourage them? That's a calling that we all have, to do both of these things. Because this world is a crazy and chaotic place, and it's hard to find calm. It's hard to find peace. And our screens, our phones, our TVs, our laptops, our iPads, these things will always be sucking us in to drama and emotion and anger and chaos. And hard things will find us in real life too. Things like illness, unemployment, when there's injustice in the world and in our community, when we're dealing with hard things in our relationships. We don't have to go looking for challenge. Challenge will find us in our everyday lives. What we do at church when we gather together regularly is to look to Jesus to be our calm, to look to Jesus to fill us up with what we need so that we can go back out to the chaos of our lives to face whatever adversity is out there. And it's my hope that every time we gather, that we create a safe and secure environment where there is trust, where we can learn from God and learn from one another in this gathered space, where we can find role models of faith, where we can cheer each other on, where we can hear those hard truths, like the importance of being willing to forgive one another and to have that ability to try again and to be able to encourage one another to keep trying again in all the things that we do each day, sometimes failing and sometimes succeeding. The chaos will always be there. So we come here to be reminded that Jesus is our calm.